The last thing he said to her was not goodbye. It was not "I love you." It was 4 words she had heard 1,000 times before, spoken from a hospital bed on a cold November night in 1886 while the harbor outside sat dark and still and the lighthouse they had kept together stood alone on its rock in the water, its lamp dark for the first time in years. For words that would quietly become the whole architecture of the next 33 years of her life. He looked at her from the pillow, his breath shallow, his hands resting open on the blanket beside him, and he said, "Mind the light, Kate." She was 38 years old. She was a widow for the second time. She was alone on a rock in the middle of New York Harbor with 2 children and a lighthouse to run and a harbor full of ships that did not know her name but needed her light every single night without exception. And she could have left. Nobody would have blamed her for a moment. Nobody would have said a single word against a woman who packed her trunks and walked away from a life that had already asked more of her than most people are ever asked to give. But she did not leave. She went back across the dark water to the lighthouse. She climbed the stairs. She trimmed the wicks. And she minded the light. Somewhere off the northern shore of Staten Island, in the middle of New York Harbor, there is a small cast-iron lighthouse that has been standing on a rocky reef since 1883. It is not famous the way the Statue of Liberty is famous. Tourists do not cross oceans to photograph it. It sits out on the water, a quiet gray tower on a granite pier, unremarkable to anyone who does not know its story. But the harbor pilots who have navigated these waters for generations know it by a name that no government committee ever assigned and no official document ever ratified. They call it Kate's Light, not the Robbins Reef Lighthouse, not the Robbins Reef Station. Kate's Light, named for the woman who kept it burning through 33 years of ice storms and fog and grief, and the particular loneliness of a life lived entirely on water, surrounded on all sides by a harbor that did not pause to ask whether she was tired or whether the cold was extraordinary or whether the work had become more than any reasonable person could be expected to carry. Tonight, on the Village Time Forgot, this is her story. And by the time it is over you will understand exactly why they named it for her and why, more than 100 years later, the name has never gone away. Before we begin, I want to tell you something about Kate Walker that most people who have heard her name have never been told. She was 4 feet 10 inches tall. She weighed less than 100 pounds her entire adult life. She spoke almost no English when she arrived in this country as a widow in her early 30s with a 7-year-old boy and a single trunk of belongings. And in the 33 years she spent on that lighthouse, she saved more than 50 lives. She rowed her 2 children to school across one of the most treacherous stretches of harbor water on the eastern seaboard, 1 mile each way, alone in every weather, because the school was on the mainland and there was no other way to get them there. She hauled oil up 5 flights of spiral stairs in the middle of the night when the lamps needed refilling. She went out in her small wooden rowboat in conditions that gave professional sailors pause, because there were men in the water and she was the closest person to them, and the water was cold enough to kill, and the minutes were counting down. She did all of this without complaint and without ever suggesting that any of it was remarkable. She did it because a man she loved had asked her to mind the light. Tonight, I want you to hold on to that as we go. Something about what it means to keep a promise when the person you made it to is no longer there to see you keep it. Hold on to that. It will mean something before the night is through. Before we go any further into Kate's story tonight, I want to stop and ask you to do something. Drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. You might be surprised how many people are lying in the dark right now, in different corners of this country and beyond, listening to these exact same words at the exact same moment. You are not alone tonight. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Every story on the Murmured Garden is true, chosen because it carries something worth carrying into sleep. If tonight is your first night here, welcome. This channel was built for exactly this moment, the end of a long day, the settling of the body into stillness, the quiet that comes when the noise of the world finally falls away and a story can do what stories were always meant to do, which is carry you somewhere safe and leave you there to rest. Now, let us go back to the very beginning, back to a small town in Germany in the middle of the 19th century, back to a life that had been decided before she was old enough to choose it, and back to the moment when she decided to leave it entirely. The town of Rumbach sits in the Palatinate Hills of southwestern Germany, a place that existed in more or less the same form for centuries before Katharina Gortler was born there in 1848. The streets were narrow and cobbled, and the rooftops were steep against the rain, and the church at the center of town had been there longer than any family's memory reached. Life in Rumbach moved at the pace of the land and the seasons, slowly and with the weight of accumulated habit, and the life available to a girl born into a modest household in that place in 1848 was a life whose shape was largely determined before the girl had any say in it. You were born. You were christened. You went to school for the years that were considered sufficient. You were put to work. You were married to someone from the village or a neighboring farm, and you kept a house and raised children and did the work that women in such communities had always done. And the world beyond the hills was something heard about in fragments and not seriously considered as a destination. This was the world that Katharina Gortler was born into. For the first years of her life, she lived within its expectations. And then the first husband died and the expected shape of her life came apart. And Katharina Gortler looked at what remained and made a decision that changed everything. She would leave Germany entirely. She would take Jacob and whatever she could carry and board a ship for the United States of America and start her life over in a country she had never seen, speaking a language she did not speak, with no family waiting and no plan beyond the conviction that what she was leaving behind was not worth staying for. In 1882, Katharina Gortler and her 7-year-old son, Jacob, boarded a ship and crossed the Atlantic. The voyage in steerage was weeks at sea in conditions designed to move the maximum number of people across the ocean for the minimum cost. Below the waterline, the light was inadequate and the air was close and the sound of the ocean was a constant presence, moving through the hull with the persistent indifference of something very large and very old. The people around Katharina were emigrants from across Europe, each one carrying their own version of the same essential story. Something had ended, something had closed, and they had chosen the extraordinary option of beginning again somewhere they had never been. Katharina arrived in New York Harbor speaking almost no English. She had no family waiting, no apartment arranged, no job secured, no safety net of any kind. She found work at a boarding house in Sandy Hook, New Jersey, washing dishes and waiting tables and learning English one word at a time from the men and women who passed through. She listened to everything carefully and stored what she heard with the focused attention of someone who understands that knowledge is the most portable form of security available to a person in uncertain circumstances. She had been at Sandy Hook for some time, working her long days and listening carefully and watching Jacob grow into a boy who was beginning to understand that his safety was entirely in his mother's hands and that her hands were steady, when Captain John Walker came through the door of the boarding house and offered to give her English lessons. He was the keeper of the Sandy Hook Lighthouse, a Civil War Navy veteran, steady and practical and unhurried in the way of men who have spent their lives near water. What began as an exchange of words across a table became, over time, something neither of them had planned for. A friendship first, then something warmer, and then a marriage. Katharina Gortler became Kate Walker, and the question of what came next had its answer. Kate and John Walker made their home on the grounds of the Sandy Hook Lighthouse and for a period of years life settled into something that felt like solid ground after a long time of standing on uncertain footing. The Sandy Hook posting was land-based, which meant Kate could keep a garden. She planted vegetables and flowers near the keeper's quarters, the kind of small domestic cultivation that speaks of a person who has decided that this ground is worth tending, and that beauty alongside practicality is not a luxury but a necessity of a fully lived life. She had a daughter with John named Mary, to join Jacob, who was growing steadily into a capable and observant boy. She learned lighthouse work alongside John with a thoroughness that went considerably beyond what the role of keeper's wife technically required. She understood the wicks and how they needed to be trimmed to a precise height, so they burned cleanly without producing the soot that fouled the lens. She understood the Fresnel lens itself, that beautiful piece of French optical engineering with its concentric rings of precisely ground glass designed to focus the lamp's light into a directed beam rather than allowing it to disperse in all directions, and she knew how to clean it and why the cleanliness of its surface was not a matter of aesthetics but a matter of the beam's range, and therefore a matter of the safety of ships navigating in the dark. She understood the clockwork mechanism that rotated the lens, driven by descending weights in the manner of a long case clock, requiring winding at regular intervals through the night to maintain the steady rotation. She understood the logbook and the standard it required. She learned all of this because she was the kind of person who, when placed near something important, learns everything there is to know about it. In 1885, the lighthouse establishment reassigned John Walker to the Robbins Reef Lighthouse, a small cast-iron structure sitting on a rocky reef about a mile off the northern shore of Staten Island in New York Harbor. When Kate first saw it, surrounded on every side by harbor water with no land and no garden and no neighbors within walking distance because walking was not an option, she refused to unpack her trunks. She stood in the circular kitchen and looked at the harbor through every window and told John plainly that she had not agreed to this. At Sandy Hook she had neighbors and a garden and solid ground under her feet every time she stepped outside. At Robbins Reef there was water in every direction, and the nearest shore was a rowboat ride away, and the rowboat was the only transportation, and the harbor was not reliably cooperative about when you could use it. She had children. The logistics of keeping a small child safe on a platform surrounded by harbor water were not trivial. Kate said all of this to John clearly and without softening. John was patient. He did not argue or minimize what she was saying. He gave her time. And Kate, who had crossed an ocean and rebuilt her life from nothing in a country whose language she had arrived not speaking, found that she could not quite locate in herself the willingness to retreat from something merely because it was difficult. A little at a time, she said years later when journalists asked her about it, she unpacked her trunks. After a while they were all unpacked, and she stayed on. Every evening a cannon shot from the military installation at Governor's Island signaled sunset. That was Kate's cue. She would put down whatever she was doing and make her way up through the circular rooms of the tower, kitchen to sitting room to bedrooms to fifth floor to lantern room, carrying fresh oil if the reservoir needed filling. She would light the 8 oil-burning lamps backed by their polished reflectors. The fourth-order Fresnel lens, rotating on its clockwork mount, would begin its 6-second cycle. Beam then dark, a pulse that ship captains and harbor pilots could identify from miles out at sea because they knew the interval and the characteristic of this specific light. The clockwork mechanism needed winding every few hours through the night as the weights descended. Kate went up the stairs at those intervals, wound the mechanism, checked the oil level, trimmed the wicks if they showed any tendency toward the uneven flame that would produce soot and begin to foul the lens. She did this from sunset to sunrise. At dawn she extinguished the lamps and covered the lens to protect the carefully ground glass from direct sunlight. And then the daytime work began. Every day she cleaned the brasswork of the lamp fittings, and every month she polished the Fresnel lens. A 2-day task she described in interviews with the matter-of-fact brevity of someone reporting a known item on a known schedule. The lens was the heart of the lighthouse's function. Its cleanliness was directly proportional to the range of the beam and the safety of the ships in the channel below. The fog was the condition that made everything most demanding. It could arrive from the outer bay at any hour of any season, reducing visibility from miles to yards in minutes, leaving every vessel in the harbor dependent on sound for its navigation. When the fog came in, Kate went down to the cellar and started the engine that powered the foghorn, which sounded at 3-second intervals and carried across the channel with enough force to reach vessels well before they reached the reef. If the engine failed, she went to the handbell and struck it at measured intervals herself, keeping the signal going until the engine could be repaired. There are accounts in the historical record of Kate signaling to the mainland when the fog signal machinery broke down, alerting the lighthouse depot to send repairs, and maintaining the hand signal through the hours until help arrived. On the foggiest nights, the harbor traffic was densest with the kinds of vessels most in need of the signal. Smaller craft whose captains had less margin for error, fishing boats and ferries, and coastal traders whose navigators were counting the seconds between foghorn blasts to calculate their distance from the reef. Kate stayed awake on those nights. She went down to the cellar to check the engine, came back up to check the lamps, went up to wind the clockwork, came back down to listen to the harbor. She did not sleep when the fog was on the water. The ships were out there. They needed the sound and they needed the light. Every school day, weather permitting, Kate rode her children to school on Staten Island. 1 mile each way in an open wooden rowboat across harbor water that was, depending on the day and the season, placid or choppy or actively difficult. She pulled the oars herself, managing the current that ran around the reef in patterns she had learned through years of attention, watching the water's surface for the signs that told her what was happening below it. Jacob sat in the bow with his school things and watched his mother's hands on the oars and understood, as he grew older, what the crossing cost in effort and exposure and the particular vulnerability of a small wooden boat in one of the world's busiest harbors, and what it meant that she made it without complaint every single day. Mary, younger, grew up thinking this was simply how children got to school. In a rowboat with their mother at the oars, across a mile of harbor water before the day had properly begun. When Jacob was old enough to help with the rowing, he did. But in the years before that, it was Kate's alone, and she treated it the way she treated everything necessary. It needed doing, so she did it, and the size of what needed doing was not a factor she weighed before deciding to begin. What Kate Walker developed over the years of her life at Robbins Reef was the particular relationship with New York Harbor that only comes from living on it rather than beside it. She learned to read the water the way a farmer reads the sky, not as a collection of data points to be analyzed, but as a continuous living text in a language that, once you are fluent in it, you process without conscious thought. The way the surface moved under a specific wind, the quality of the stillness that preceded fog, the color of the sky toward the southeast that meant a storm was building in the outer bay and would be in the channel within hours. The behavior of the current around the reef at different stages of the tide, which channels ran fast and which turned, where a small boat could be carried sideways if you failed to account for it. She learned the shipping traffic the way a long-term resident learns the traffic patterns of a city, which vessels came through regularly and at what hours, which captains were cautious and which were not. All of this accumulated over years of daily experience into something less like a body of facts and more like an intuition, a continuous background awareness of the harbor state that informed everything she did on it. This knowledge was not incidental to her work. It was the foundation of it, the thing that made the rescues possible and the fog crossings survivable and the supply runs manageable year after year. In the autumn of 1886, John Walker became ill. The illness began as a chest cold, ordinary enough in its initial presentation, and for a time John managed it without slowing down. He kept the log and tended the lamps and made the supply runs. But the cold did not clear in the days and weeks that followed. It settled deeper into his chest with the determined progression of bronchopneumonia, the kind of respiratory illness that in 1886 had no effective treatment and that the cold and damp of a cast-iron tower on a harbor reef did nothing to ease. By the time the seriousness was undeniable, John Walker was gravely ill, and the decision was made to have him transported to a hospital on Staten Island. Kate stayed on the reef. There was no one else to stay with it, and the light could not go dark. She ran Robbins Reef alone through the weeks of John's hospitalization, keeping every element of the station functioning with the competence of someone who had been learning this work for years and knew every aspect of it in her own right. The harbor pilots who navigated by the Robbins Reef beam on those nights had no way of knowing that the person who had lit it and was keeping it turning was working completely alone on the other side of the dark harbor. John Walker died in the autumn of 1886. He was in his early 50s. Kate was 38, a widow for the second time, alone on a cast-iron reef in the middle of New York Harbor with 2 children and a lighthouse. His last words to her, spoken from the hospital bed in those final hours as she sat beside him, were not a farewell. They were not a declaration of love or a summary of a life or any of the things we might imagine a dying person saying. They were the same 4 words he had spoken to her in the ordinary business of their daily life on the reef, the words he said every time he went below to sleep for a few hours and left the watch to her, every time the responsibility of the light passed from his hands to hers. "Mind the light, Kate." She rowed back across the dark harbor alone, and she climbed the stairs, and she wound the clockwork, and she trimmed the wicks, and she checked the oil level, and she opened the logbook to the current page, and she recorded the weather and the time and the state of the harbor traffic in her careful handwriting. And the next evening she lit the lamps again. And the evening after that. For 33 years she lit the lamps, because he had asked her to, and because the ships still needed the light. Kate applied to the Lighthouse establishment for the permanent keeper position. The application was not welcomed. The officials were skeptical in the reflexive institutional way of bodies that had not made space for this kind of person before. She was small. She was a widow with dependent children. Robbins Reef was isolated and demanding and genuinely dangerous. These were the reasons offered. The fact that Kate had been operating the station alone and correctly for weeks already did not carry sufficient weight to overcome the board's assumptions. They placed her in a temporary capacity at reduced pay and began looking for a male keeper to replace her. The first man offered the position turned it down. Robbins Reef was too isolated, too physically demanding, too cut off from ordinary life on shore. The second man offered it also declined. A third candidate was considered and he too declined. After 3 years of doing the full work on a temporary appointment and reduced salary, Kate Walker received a letter informing her that President Benjamin Harrison had appointed her as the permanent keeper of the Robbins Reef Lighthouse. She had been doing the job for 3 years already. Now she was being paid properly for it. The harbor pilots named it. Not a committee, not a ceremony, not an official body with the authority to attach a name to a government installation. The men who spent their careers guiding ships through the channels of New York Bay began calling Robbins Reef by a name that had not existed before Kate and would not exist without her. Kate's Light. The name spread through the harbor community the way names spread when they carry truth in them without promotion, simply by being the accurate word for the thing being named. An inspection report from the Lighthouse District noted that the station had the reputation of being the cleanest and best-kept light in the entire 3rd District. When the Harper's weekly reporters came in 1909 and asked her about the difficulty and the isolation and the long years of sole responsibility, She gave them the reply that had become the consistent summary of everything she had done. "It is not much of a story," she said. "Just keep the light burning and the fog bell wound up and the siren ready all the time. That is all." New York Harbor, in the years of Kate Walker's tenure at Robbins Reef, was one of the busiest bodies of navigable water in the world. The volume and variety of the shipping that moved through it was extraordinary. Great ocean liners making the Atlantic crossing, coastal steamers running freight and passengers along the eastern seaboard, the Staten Island Ferry making its crossings dozens of times daily, tugboats pushing strings of barges laden with coal and stone and timber through the main channels, fishing boats working the outer bay in the early mornings, private vessels of every size threading through the professional traffic, all of it moving through channels marked with buoys and lights, and the accumulated expertise of harbor pilots who had dedicated careers to learning the particular geography and behavior of this water. And even with all of that, the harbor claimed vessels with a regularity that was sobering. Fog was the constant hazard. Ice in the severe winters. The storms that rolled up from the south in autumn and drove vessels before them with forces that overwhelmed the available engine power to resist. When a vessel found the reef at the wrong angle in the wrong conditions, it found it hard and suddenly, and the crew went into the water, and the water was cold, and Kate Walker was the closest person to them. The rescues were not part of Kate Walker's official duties as lighthouse keeper. The government had contracted with her to maintain the light, maintain the fog signal, maintain the station, and keep the log. Nothing in the keeper's position required her to launch a rowboat into harbor water that had just wrecked a larger vessel and extract men from water cold enough to kill in minutes. But when Kate heard a vessel strike the reef or saw the lights of a ship in distress in the channel, she went. She did not calculate the risk or weigh the difficulty against the likelihood of success. She launched the boat and went. She went alone in the years before Jacob was old enough to help in a rescue. A woman who weighed less than 100 pounds, in a small wooden rowboat, in whatever the harbor happened to be doing at that specific moment, pulling toward the sound of men in the water. She pulled them out. By her own count, she saved 50 lives over her years at Robbins Reef. Other estimates from people who knew the harbor and knew Kate placed the number higher, some as far as 75. She also saved, on at least one documented occasion, a ship's dog that had gone into the water with the crew when their vessel came apart on the reef. She pulled the dog into the boat alongside the sailors without apparent consideration of whether it was worth the additional effort. It needed help, so she helped it. There was one winter crossing that Kate Walker herself described in her later years as the time she came closest to not returning. She had made the run to the Staten Island shore for supplies in conditions that seemed manageable when she pushed away from the caisson. On the return, a storm built from the outer bay with the speed that harbor storms can achieve when nothing stands between them and the open Atlantic. The swells built. The wind came up hard from the south and brought snow with it, driving horizontally across the water with a force that made it nearly impossible to see the bow of the rowboat from the stern. Kate rowed for 3 hours. A passing ferry spotted her in the storm and towed her as close to the lighthouse caisson as the conditions would allow, and she climbed the iron ladder from the waterline to the platform with ice on her coat and hands that had lost the ability to fully feel what they were holding. She went inside. She checked the lamps and the clockwork and the oil level. She came back down and changed her clothes and made supper for the children and recorded the crossing in the log with the brevity she applied to everything. Weather conditions, duration, outcome. The fact that she had come close to not making it back was the context. The fact that she had made it back was the point. There is a second story preserved in the records of the Noble Maritime Collection on Staten Island that reveals the texture of the daily risk at Robbins Reef. During a storm, Kate's rowboat broke free from its mooring on the caisson. Without the rowboat, she was completely cut off, No way to reach the mainland, no way to get help if anything went wrong at the lighthouse. She went out onto the catwalk in the storm to secure it. As she wrestled with the mooring chain in the dark and the wet, the chain swung with the motion of the boat on the water and struck her in the eye with a force that put white behind her vision and staggered her on the narrow platform. At the same moment a gust caught her with enough force to push her toward the railing. She held on. She secured the chain. She secured the boat. She went back inside and attended to her eye and then went up to check the lamps because the lamps were what mattered and the eye could be attended to when the lamps had been checked. The incident was noted in the log. It was not noted as remarkable. The winters at Robbins Reef were not gentle and they were not brief. Cold arrived in November and held on into March, and in between those months it did things to the lighthouse that summer visitors could not have imagined. The harbor froze in the hardest winters, ice forming first in the shallow waters near shore and pushing outward into the main channel in sheets and ridges that turned the harbor's familiar surface into something alien and white and slow-moving. The lighthouse itself accumulated ice on every exposed surface. On the catwalk railing, on the lantern room windows, on the chains and fittings that held things in place. Kate went out onto the catwalk in ice storms to scrape the lantern room windows by hand, gripping the railing with hands the cold had made clumsy, scraping the ice away methodically one window after another until the glass was clear again and the beam could carry its full 12 miles. The lamp oil thickened in severe cold and required careful management to maintain the clean burn the lens depended on. The clockwork mechanism ran slower in extreme cold and needed more frequent attention. Winter at Robbins Reef meant more work in conditions that made every part of the work harder. And Kate did the winter work the same way she did the summer work, which is to say completely and without complaint. Spring came to the harbor later than it came to the land, because the water held the cold of winter longer than the earth did, and released it slowly and reluctantly through March and into April. But when spring finally arrived at Robbins Reef, it came in ways that Kate would have known from years of watching. The ice in the shallower parts of the harbor broke up first, cracks appearing in the sheet that had been solid for weeks and widening over days into channels of dark water that moved with the particular vitality of water recently freed from constraint. The shipping traffic that had been careful and cautious through the winter months began to quicken. More vessels moving through the channel with a confidence that the ice's departure had restored. The birds returned, the harbor gulls that were always present but that multiplied in spring with a loudness that was its own kind of seasonal announcement, circling the lighthouse caisson and settling on the railing and the gallery with the proprietary ease of creatures that considered the reef their territory. The days lengthened. The light at sunset changed from the thin pale light of winter to something with more warmth in it, touching the water with colors that the winter light never produced. Kate would have felt the spring in the harbor before she felt it in the air, in the way the water moved and the way the light fell on the surface in the late afternoons. Summer at Robbins Reef was the season that offered the most generous version of the view from the balcony on the 5th floor. In the long light of a June evening, standing on that balcony, you would see Manhattan to the north with its skyline growing year by year through Kate's decades there. The towers climbing out of the lower end of the island in the ambition of a city that had decided it was going to go as high as the technology of the moment would permit. To the northeast, the Statue of Liberty, her torch raised above the harbor in the particular stillness of a monument that has been standing long enough to have become part of the landscape. To the south and west, the Narrows opening toward the outer bay and beyond it the Atlantic, the direction from which the ships came and toward which they returned. Directly below the balcony, the harbor traffic in its endless variety, the whole commerce of the port playing out on the water in the long summer light. The cast-iron walls of the lighthouse absorbed the summer sun through the long days and gave it back as warmth in the evenings, and on certain calm summer nights when the harbor was flat and the city lights were doubled in the water below, the The balcony at Robbins Reef offered a view of the world that was difficult to call anything but beautiful. Autumn was the season that brought the harbor back to full serious attention after the relative ease of summer. The storms that moved up the coast from the south in October and November were the most dangerous of the year, carrying the accumulated energy of the Atlantic's warm summer water and arriving with a force and unpredictability that required the lighthouse to be at its most reliable at exactly the moment the harbor was at its most hazardous. The fog of autumn was different from other fogs, thicker and more persistent, settling into the channel with a density that reduced visibility to near zero and stayed there for hours and sometimes days, the foghorn running continuously through the night and into the morning and sometimes through the following night again. The light was needed most urgently in autumn, and autumn was when the demands on Kate were highest, the nights longest, the cold beginning to establish itself in the cast-iron walls of the tower, the harbor traffic densest with vessels trying to complete their runs before the winter weather made the coastal routes genuinely dangerous. Kate moved through autumn the way she moved through everything, with the steady attention of someone who has learned exactly what each condition requires and provides it without measuring the effort against the difficulty. 33 winters, 33 springs, 33 summers on that balcony watching the city grow and the ships pass and the harbor change its face with the seasons. 33 autumns of fog and storm and the lighthouse at its most essential. Kate Walker lived through all of these cycles on that reef, and each one accumulated into the next, year after year, the routine deepening with repetition into something that was less a job and more a way of being in the world. The harbor was not the setting of her life at Robbins Reef. It was the substance of it. It was the thing she read every morning when she woke and every evening when she lit the lamps and every night when she went up the stairs to wind the clockwork and check the oil. It was the language she spoke fluently, the one that had no adequate translation into the language of people who had not spent 33 years on a rock in the middle of it learning its every variation. In 1892, Ellis Island opened as the primary federal immigration station for the United States, and the harbor Kate tended became the first piece of America that millions of people ever saw. The ships carrying those immigrants came through the Narrows and into the upper bay on a route that took them close to Robbins Reef, and they would have seen the lighthouse from their decks as they passed. They would not have known whose light it was. They would not have known that the woman who kept it had made the same crossing they were completing, had arrived in this harbor as a widow with a child and almost nothing else, and had rebuilt her life one careful step at a time until it had brought her to this reef and this lighthouse and this work that the harbor depended on every night. She could not know, watching those ships pass from her lantern room, how many of the people on their decks carried stories that resembled her own. She simply kept the light burning for them as she kept it for everyone on the water, because they needed it, and because she had said she would. The skyline of Manhattan changed continuously and dramatically through Kate's decades at Robbins Reef, and the change was visible from the lighthouse balcony in real time from a fixed point. The towers that were ambitious in the 1880s were dwarfed by those of the 1890s, which were overtopped by those of the early 1900s. The Flatiron Building appeared on the skyline in 1902. The Singer Tower in 1908. The Metropolitan Life Tower in 1909, the Woolworth Building in 1913, 60 stories of Gothic terracotta that held the title of world's tallest for 17 years. Kate watched each of these appear from the same balcony, the same lighthouse, the same harbor. The world outside the reef accelerated away from the world she inhabited, which moved on the slower rhythm of the tides and the seasons and the 6-second pulse of the light. The harbor itself changed too, the ships growing larger and faster as steam technology advanced, the immigration traffic peaking before the First World War and then shifting as American immigration policy changed. Kate watched all of it. She kept the light burning through all of it. The fixed point held while everything around it moved. In 1909, 3 reporters from Harper's Weekly came out to Robbins Reef by hired boat to interview Kate Walker. She was 61 years old and had been the Lighthouse's principal keeper for 19 years. Kate received the reporters with the composed good humor of a busy person who has agreed to an interview and intends to be helpful without allowing it to interfere significantly with the work. She showed them around the lighthouse. She answered their questions directly and without embellishment. She was photographed in the kitchen, standing in the circular room looking directly at the camera with the expression of someone who is simply present, not performing anything, not arranging themselves for effect. When they asked about the difficulty and the isolation and the long years of sole responsibility, she gave them the reply that had become the consistent summary of everything she had done. "It is not much of a story," she said. "Just keep the light burning and the fog bell wound up and the siren ready all the time. That is all." The reporters wanted more. Kate did not have more that she considered relevant to the subject. Jacob Walker became Kate's assistant keeper in 1896, and the work that Kate had been carrying alone for 10 years was shared between them. The physical demands of the nighttime rounds and the daytime maintenance, the engine work and the fog signal management and the supply crossings, all of it that had been one person's sole responsibility became 2 people's shared responsibility. Kate's daughter Mary grew up at Robbins Reef, and later Kate's daughter-in-law Loretta came to live at the Lighthouse, and then Kate's grandchildren, 5 of them, grew up in those circular cast-iron rooms between Staten Island and the Statue of Liberty. 5 children raised in a lighthouse in the middle of New York Harbor, falling asleep to the rhythm of the 6-second pulse, waking to the sound of harbor traffic and the smell of lamp oil, growing up understanding without being told that the light was the most important thing in the building and that their grandmother was the reason it was always burning. The lighthouse that Kate had refused to inhabit had become, year by year, the home of a family. The place she had said she would not stay had become the place most entirely hers. In 1919, a government regulation mandated retirement for lighthouse keepers at age 71. Kate Walker was 71. A letter arrived informing her that after 34 years at Robbins Reef, 33 of them as its keeper, her service was complete and her retirement was required. She did not rage against it or appeal it. She accepted it with the quiet pragmatism she had brought to every difficult thing since the death of her first husband. But leaving was the hardest thing Kate Walker had done since the night she rode back from the hospital in 1886. She wrote her final log entries in the same handwriting she had used for 33 years. She took a last inventory of the oil stores and the lamp condition and the engine. She walked up the spiral stairs to the lantern room one final time and stood in the room where she had spent more hours of her life than any other place on earth and looked out at the harbor from every window. Then she came back down and packed her trunks and left. The same trunks she had refused to unpack when she first arrived. Now they were packed again, and this time there was no staying on. She moved to a small cottage on Staten Island from which, on clear days, she could see the lighthouse. Harbor pilots who visited her in retirement reported that she kept binoculars at the window and watched the light come on each evening. The light was being kept by a Coast Guard crew now, for men assigned to do what she had done first alone and then with Jacob for 33 years. For men with modern equipment and regular rotation and institutional support. For men. Kate herself did not speak publicly about this arithmetic. She watched the light from her window and answered the questions of the journalists and visitors who came, and received the recognition that arrived in the last years of her life with the same composure she had brought to everything else. Neither seeking it nor refusing it, simply present with it. The harbor pilots still called it Kate's Light. The name did not require her presence to persist. It was accurate, and right names last. When the Coast Guard assigned a crew of 4 men to Robbins Reef after Kate's retirement, The arithmetic was noted by people who knew the harbor and knew what she had done. For men with modern equipment and regular relief rotation and all the institutional resources of the United States Coast Guard available to support them, to do what Kate Walker had done with oil lamps and a handbell and a clockwork mechanism and a wooden rowboat and 4 words from a dying man. The reasons offered for doubting Kate Walker when she first applied for the permanent position, her size and her widowhood and her gender, had turned out to have no bearing whatsoever on her ability to do the work. She had done it better than anyone who came after her, measured by the only standard that finally counts, which is, was the light burning when the ships needed it? It was. For 33 years it was. Kate Walker died on February 5, 1931, at the age of 82. The New York Evening Post published her obituary, and the person who wrote it found the right words. In a harbor rich in romance, among the great ships and the famous skyline and the grand machinery of commerce and history, there had lived this sturdy little woman, proud of her work and content in it, keeping her lamp alight and her windows clean so that the harbor might be safe for ships that pass in the night. The United States Coast Guard named a ship for her, the USCGS Catherine Walker, a coastal buoy tender assigned to New York Harbor, carries her name across the waters she once tended. A statue was commissioned as part of New York City's She Built NYC initiative. The Lighthouse is in the National Register of Historic Places, and harbor pilots still call it Kate's Light, not from obligation, because the name is right, and right names last. There is something underneath all the details of Kate Walker's life at Robbins Reef, running beneath the rescues and the storms and the paperwork and the 33 years, something I want to name before the story settles into sleep. It is something about the nature of promises, about what it means to commit to something and honor that commitment not in the bright moments when it is easy and recognition is available, but in the dark moments at 2 in the morning in a January ice storm, when the cold is extraordinary and the work is relentless and no one is watching and the only thing carrying you forward is the fact that you said you would. Kate Walker understood this at a level that was not philosophical but entirely practical. She was not keeping the light as an act of sentiment or a memorial to a dead man's last wish. She was keeping it because the ships were still passing in the channel after dark, and the channel was still dangerous, and the ships still needed to know where the reef was. The practicality of the need was what made the promise real through 33 years of nights. She had said she would mind the light. The light needed minding. Every night. That was all. There is a particular kind of love in Kate Walker's story that does not make noise about itself and does not require witnesses. It is not the love that arrives with declarations at the beginning of things when hope is easy. It is the love that is present at the long middle and the quiet end, when the person you are doing it for has been gone for decades and the only audience is the dark harbor and the passing ships who do not know your name. John loved Kate well enough to ask her, from his dying bed, for something that mattered to him. Kate loved John well enough to honor that request every single day for the rest of her working life, not as a tribute but as a continuation of the work they had shared, carried forward by her alone when he was no longer there to share it. And the sailors whose ships passed safely through New York Harbor because the light was burning were cared for too, by a woman who never knew their names and whom they would never meet, who simply made sure the light was there when they needed it. This is what devotion looks like, stripped of everything decorative. It looks like someone alone at 3 in the morning climbing the stairs for the 4th time that night to do the thing that needs doing because it needs doing and they said they would. You have been listening for a long time and the story has carried you far. From a cobblestone street in Germany to a boarding house in New Jersey to a rocky reef in the middle of New York Harbor. Through ice storms and rescues and the long steady rhythm of a life built on 4 words. Your body knows it has been a long journey. Your breathing has slowed. The weight of the day is somewhere behind you where it belongs, and there is nothing in front of you tonight except warmth and stillness and the quiet harbor beyond your window. You do not need to hold on to anything. Let the harbor carry you the way it carried Kate through the long night watches, steadily, without drama, with the peace of a person who knows their work and has decided to do it well. Some lights are not just for seeing by. Some lights are for holding onto in the dark. Let this one hold you now. Your body is heavy now. That is the weight of the day leaving, finding its way out of your shoulders and your hands and the back of your neck, draining away into the warmth of the bed beneath you. Your breathing has found its own slow rhythm, the deep, unhurried rhythm of a body that has decided to rest and means it. There is nothing you need to do right now. There is nowhere you need to be. The work of today is finished and the work of tomorrow has not yet begun, and in between them is this. The warmth, the stillness, the quiet harbor, the light blinking its patient 6-second pulse out in the water. You are safe here. You are warm here. You are exactly where you are meant to be. The harbor is dark now and has been dark for hours. The great shipping traffic that fills New York Bay in the daylight has thinned to almost nothing. A few lights move across the water in the distance, unhurried, their reflections trembling in the slow movement of the harbor surface below them. The ferry crossings stopped hours ago. The pilot boats are at their moorings along the Staten Island waterfront with their engines quiet. The channel that Robbins Reef has been marking for over 100 years is empty now. The hazard it marks irrelevant until morning when the traffic begins again. The water moves anyway. The water always moves. It has no reason to stop, and it does not stop. Tide flowing in and then reversing and flowing out in the patient rhythm that was old before the first lighthouse was built on this reef, and that will be old long after the last one is gone. The lighthouse blinks. 6 seconds. Then dark. 6 seconds. Then dark. The beam sweeps the empty channel and comes around again and again, keeping its promise to a harbor that is sleeping. If you could be inside Robbins Reef Lighthouse at this hour, in the middle of Kate Walker's years there, this is what you would find. The kitchen on the first floor cold and quiet. The stove banked for the night. The smell of the day's cooking faint in the circular room. The sitting room above it dark. The logbook open on the desk to a page of careful handwriting. The last entry recording the weather at midnight and the state of the harbor and the condition of the equipment. The bedrooms above that quiet, the children sleeping, Mary with her arm thrown over the edge of the bunk the way children sleep when they feel entirely safe. Jacob in the upper bunk with one hand against the curved iron wall of the lighthouse, feeling through the metal the faint vibration of the harbor moving around the caisson below. And somewhere in the tower, Kate. On the stairs or in the lantern room making her rounds. Going up the spiral stairs with the measured tread of someone who has made this climb thousands of times and knows every step by feel in the dark. Checking the oil, checking the wicks, checking the rotation speed of the lens, coming back down. Sitting in the sitting room in the dark with the harbor on every side and the light blinking above her in its steady 6-second pulse. Waiting for the next interval that requires her attention. This was her night. Every night. For 33 years. On the quiet nights. The nights when the fog was off the water and the wind was down and the harbor traffic had thinned to nothing. Robbins Reef had a particular quality that was not really silence at all but rather the absence of human noise, filled instead with the sounds the harbor made on its own. The water against the base of the caisson was always there, always changing, the lightest possible lapping on still nights and a heavier rhythmic push when there was any swell at all, and in storms something altogether more insistent that went on all night without pause and became, after years of hearing it, simply the sound of the place. On still winter nights the ice against the caisson made sounds of its own, creaking and shifting with the tide. A low groaning that carried in the cold air with a clarity that the warmer months muffled. On summer evenings, the harbor gulls settled on the railing and gallery with their small, quiet conversations, the particular sounds that birds make when they are at rest. And always, underneath everything, the movement of the water, patient and continuous and entirely uninterested in whether anyone was listening. Kate heard all of this every night for 33 years. It became the sound of home. Every 6 seconds the light turned. Every 6 seconds through every night of every year of Kate Walker's tenure at Robbins Reef, without exception, the beam swept the harbor and came around again. 6 seconds of dark and then the flash. 6 seconds of dark and then the flash. This rhythm was the heartbeat of the lighthouse, the thing that made it identifiable to harbor pilots navigating in fog or dark, the specific interval they had memorized along with the specific characteristic of this beam and no other. Kate lived inside this rhythm for 33 years. She knew it the way you know the breathing of someone who has slept beside you for a long time, so thoroughly that any interruption of it would have brought her fully awake in an instant. In all those years the rhythm broke twice. Both times it was restored before morning. This is the record of a person who understood what their work required of them and provided it completely every single night, because they had committed to the work and the work required it, and that was sufficient reason. The light kept its rhythm. For 33 years the light kept its rhythm. Mind the light, Kate. And she did. Most of Kate Walker's days at Robbins Reef were not dramatic. Most of them did not involve rescues or ice storms or the particular extremity of conditions that have come to represent her life in the telling of it. Most of them were simply ordinary days on a lighthouse, shaped by the same requirements and the same rhythms that shaped every other ordinary day on the same lighthouse across 33 years. And this ordinariness is worth spending some time in because it is the actual substance of what Kate did rather than the exceptional events. An ordinary day at Robbins Reef in 1902, say, might have looked like this. Kate waking before dawn in the fourth-floor bedroom, going up to extinguish the lamps and cover the lens, coming back down to start the kitchen stove and begin breakfast for the household. The smell of coal smoke from the stove and the smell of the harbor coming through the kitchen window, salt and cold iron and the particular morning smell of water in a harbor that has been busy all night and is about to be busy again. The logbook open on the desk in the sitting room with the previous night's entries completed. The day's first weather observation to be made and recorded. The brasswork to be cleaned. The wicks to be inspected and trimmed if necessary before the lamps were needed again that evening. And all of this against the background of the harbor traffic building outside the windows, the first ferries making their morning crossings, the fishing boats heading out to the outer bay, the early commercial traffic beginning to fill the channel that the lighthouse had been marking all night. The lighthouse had its own smell, the particular smell of a cast iron structure that has been lived in and worked in continuously for decades, and Kate knew it so completely that she had long since stopped registering it the way you stop registering the smell of your own house. It was the smell of lamp oil most fundamentally, the kerosene that fueled the lamps in the early years and the incandescent oil vapor of the upgraded system in later years, a smell that permeated everything in the building from the logbook on the desk to the blankets on the beds. It was the smell of the brass polish applied to the lamp fittings every day, a sharp metallic smell that stayed on Kate's hands for hours after the polishing was done. It was the smell of coal smoke from the kitchen stove and the engine in the cellar, of the fresh water from the cistern that tasted faintly of iron, of the harbor itself coming through every crack and joint in the cast iron structure, the cold salt smell of deep water present in every room in every season. And under all of it, the particular smell of a home that has been kept carefully by someone who understands that the condition of the place she inhabits is directly related to the quality of the work she does there. This was the smell of Kate's lighthouse. It was the smell of sustained care. Kate Walker was not a person who talked about her interior life. The logbook she maintained for 33 years records the weather and the shipping traffic and the equipment condition and the maintenance actions with extraordinary precision, and records almost nothing about what it was like to be the person doing all of this. We do not know from the logbook whether Kate found the harbor beautiful. We do not know whether the long night watches were a time of peace or a time of grinding endurance. We do not know what she thought about in the hours between the rounds, sitting in the dark sitting room with the harbor on every side. What we know is that she stayed. She stayed for 33 years, and she did the work to the standard it required every single one of those days, and the logbook records it in her handwriting from the first entry to the last. A person's actions sustained over 33 years tell you something that their words cannot replicate. Kate Walker stayed and kept the light, and that staying and that keeping is the whole of her testimony about herself and about what she thought her life was for. The 3 o'clock watch was the hardest of the night. It came after the midnight round and before the pre-dawn round, and it fell in the deepest part of the night, the part where the body most urgently wants to sleep and the mind most easily surrenders its sharp attentiveness. Kate went up the stairs at 3 in the morning in every season of every year for 33 years. The stairs were the same, and the number of steps was the same, and the quality of darkness in the tower at that hour was the same. The same cold on the catwalk if she needed to go out, the same smell of oil in the reservoir, the same sound of the clockwork as she wound it back to the top of its travel and set the rotation going again. She was tired at 3 in the morning. There is no account of Kate Walker describing herself as tireless. She was a person who was often tired and who worked anyway. The tiredness was the condition. The work was the requirement. The condition did not change the requirement. The most beautiful moment in any lighthouse keeper's night, by the accounts of the people who have described it, is the last hour before dawn. The harbor traffic has thinned to almost nothing in the deepest nighttime hours, and as the darkness very slowly begins to soften toward the east, the harbor that has been black and featureless takes on the first shapes of the coming day. The water is still dark, but the darkness is beginning to differentiate, the surface becoming visible as something separate from the sky above it, the shapes of the nearest moored vessels becoming legible against the emerging gray of the pre-dawn horizon. The night sounds shift slightly, the particular quality of absolute night quiet giving way to the earliest hints of morning. A gull somewhere in the distance, the low horn of a vessel beginning its day in the outer bay, the sound of water against the caisson that is somehow different at this hour than it is at midnight. And Kate Walker, at the end of the last watch of the night, would have gone up to the lantern room and extinguished the lamps one by one and covered the lens and come out onto the gallery balcony and watched the harbor come back from the dark. She had done this more than 10,000 mornings. She had watched the harbor return from night more times than any other living person. And each morning it was the same harbor, and each morning, because she had been paying attention all night and knew what the harbor had been through in the dark, it was entirely new. John Walker asked Kate to mind the light in November of 1886, and she minded it until June of 1919, which is 32 years and 7 months, which rounds to 33 years. Every single one of those days required her to decide, at least implicitly, to continue, to stay on the reef rather than request a transfer, to do the work to the standard it required rather than a lesser standard that would also have kept the job, to go out in the rowboat when a vessel was in distress rather than wait for someone else who was not coming, to climb the stairs at 3 in the morning when the body wanted to sleep rather than trust that the clockwork would run a little longer without attention. These decisions were not dramatic. They were not even conscious most of the time, having long since settled into the automatic patterns of a life organized around a single commitment. But they were made every day for 33 years, and their accumulation is what the harbor knows as Kate's light. And what you know tonight after hearing the whole of it is why. The harbor holds everything that rests on it tonight. The great vessels at their moorings, their hulls pressing lightly against the pier faces, swaying very gently with the water's movement. The smaller boats in their slips along the waterfront, their lines holding them with the easy confidence of things that have been fastened properly. The water itself moving around all of it in the tide's ancient cycle, patient and enormous and entirely unconcerned with the hour or the darkness. And the lighthouse on its reef, standing in the dark water a mile from the shore, its light blinking into the empty channel, keeping its promise to a harbor that is sleeping. This is what reliability looks like at its most fundamental. Not the performance of reliability in a moment of visible need, but the maintenance of it through the long quiet hours when no one is watching and nothing appears to be required. Kate Walker gave this to the harbor for 33 years. The harbor has not forgotten it. Sleep now. The story is complete and the night is deep and the harbor is quiet and the light is burning. There is nothing more that is needed from you tonight. You have traveled a long distance and arrived somewhere safe, and the warmth of that place is complete and real and yours for as long as the night lasts. Kate Walker kept the light burning for 33 years, and the harbor was safer for it, and the ships came home because of it, and her name is on the light, and the light is still there. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is the whole of what a life can ask to leave behind. That the light was kept, that the harbor was safer, that the ships came home. Your body is resting. Your breath is slow. The dark behind your eyes is the right place to be at this hour. Let the harbor carry you. Let the light keep its rhythm. Let the 33 years of one woman's faithfulness to a single promise be the last thing you carry with you as the night deepens and the rest becomes complete. You are safe. You are warm. You are exactly where you are meant to be. Good night, Kate. And good night to you.